The SS Ourang Medan is a name that still makes old sailors uneasy. It's a crime scene where the killer left no fingerprints, no footprints, and no one alive to tell the story. In June 1947, in the crowded shipping lanes of the Straits of Malacca, an American vessel called the Silver Star intercepted a Morse code transmission that didn't sound like a standard distress call. It was a ledger of the dead. The operator on the other end typed out that all the officers, including the captain, were dead in the chart room and on the bridge. He warned that probably the whole crew was gone. Then, the transmission ended with two words: "I die." That specific phrase, "I die," transforms this from a maritime accident into something haunting. Late-night mysteries like this are your kind of rabbit hole. Like the video and subscribe to Sleepwalk Files. Most SOS calls are about the ship, water in the hold, engine failure, or a collision. But this was personal. It suggests a lone survivor watching his world vanish in real time, transmitting his own death sentence as it happened. The mystery is simple. What could kill every living thing on a ship, leaving the vessel intact, but the people frozen in absolute terror? The crew of the Silver Star didn't have much time to wonder. They began searching the waters between Malaysia and Sumatra, where the ocean narrows so tightly that ships are practically breathing down each other's necks. Eventually, they spotted her. The Ourang Medan was a Dutch merchant ship, and at first glance, she looked fine. There were no gaping holes in the hull, no signs of fire, and no wreckage floating around her. But as the Silver Star drew closer, they realized the ship was drifting aimlessly. There was no steam coming from the vents, and no one answering the radio. She was a derelict, a floating piece of steel with no one at the wheel. When the rescue crews finally boarded the deck, they didn't find a scene of struggle or a typical shipwreck. They found a graveyard. The crew members were sprawled on their backs, scattered across the decks. The ship's dog was dead along with them, but it was the expression on their faces that stopped the rescuers cold. The dead weren't peaceful. Their faces were frozen in a state of total shock. Their mouths were gaping open, and their eyes were staring straight up at the sun, wide and vacant. It looked as if they had all seen the same horrific thing at the exact same moment and died from the stress of it. In forensic terms, when a person dies of natural causes or sudden injury, the muscles usually relax, but an entire crew and an animal, frozen in a caricature of terror, suggests something systemic. It implies a catalyst that hit everyone simultaneously, something that stopped their hearts and terrified them in their final seconds. If there were no weapons and no wounds, we have to ask what kind of force can paralyze a human being with fear and then kill them instantly. We look at the scene from the perspective of that final radio operator. The horror becomes more concrete. He's sitting in the radio room, listening to the silence of a dead ship. He walks onto the bridge and finds the captain frozen in that same wide-eyed stare. He realizes he's the last one left. As he taps out those final words, "I die," he's reporting a fact and describing a sensation. He can feel whatever killed his crew finally reaching the radio room. If the ship was physically undamaged, the killer wasn't something that crashed into the hull. It was something that drifted over the deck, some point to the cargo, suggesting the Dutch ship was carrying something volatile or toxic that leaked into the air. But chemicals usually cause coughing, choking, or unconsciousness. They don't typically leave a crew looking like they've seen a ghost. The rescuers on the Silver Star didn't have time for a full autopsy. As they prepared to tow the Ourang Medan back to port, a sudden fire broke out in the hold. The flames spread with an unnatural speed, forcing the rescue teams to abandon ship. They watched from a distance as the vessel exploded and sank into the depths of the Straits of Malacca, taking the bodies and the evidence with it. The sinking felt like a cleanup operation. By the time the ship hit the ocean floor, the only thing left of the Ourang Medan was that Morse code transcript. This vacuum of information is where the theories started to grow. If the ship vanished to hide a secret, we have to look at what it was actually carrying in its hold before the fire started. The mystery grows when you look for the ship's paperwork. Researchers have combed through official maritime registries and accident reports, but they found nothing. There is no record of a vessel named the Ourang Medan ever being registered or sailing those waters. It's as if the ship existed only for the duration of that distress call and the rescue attempt. This absence of a paper trail mirrors other ghost ship legends, where a vessel appears out of nowhere, carries a cargo of death, and vanishes before it can be identified. It suggests the Ourang Medan might have been a black ship, a vessel operating outside the law, perhaps smuggling hazardous materials or conducting clandestine experiments during the chaotic aftermath of World War II. The ship didn't officially exist, then the fire in the hold was the final step in erasing a crime. We're left with a haunting image, a crew frozen in a state of absolute terror, a ship that officially never sailed, and a final message that is the only proof it ever existed. Was the Ourang Medan a real ship, or a ghost story designed to hide something far more dangerous? The crew of the Silver Star didn't find a ghost ship. They found a floating morgue. As they stepped across the railing and onto the decks of the Ourang Medan, they were met with a scene of absolute frozen chaos. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The men weren't just lying down, they were twisted. Their limbs were contorted, their mouths were gaping open, and their eyes were wide, staring at something the rescue party couldn't see. Even the ship's dog was dead, its lips peeled back in a vicious snarl, as if it had died fighting an invisible enemy. The rescue party pushed deeper into the ship, moving from the open decks into the heart of the vessel. They reached the bridge in the chart room, where they found the captain and his officers. These men hadn't tried to hide or run for the lifeboats. They were found exactly where they were supposed to be, dead at their posts. The most haunting discovery was the radio operator. He was sprawled directly over his communications equipment, his body slumped over the very keys he had used to send that final desperate Morse code message. When you see a crew dead at their stations like that, it tells you something about the timing. This wasn't a slow sickness or a gradual leak of gas that gave people hours to react. Whatever hit the Ourang Medan was sudden and total. It was a flash freeze of mortality. One moment they were navigating the Indian Ocean, the next they were corpses. The fact that the radio operator died mid-sentence suggests the catastrophe didn't just kill the crew, it stopped them in their tracks. But as the rescue team began to look closer at the bodies, the horror shifted from the scene to the science. They were looking for the cause of death. In a violent attack, you expect to see blood, struggle, or weapon marks. If it had been a fire or an explosion, there would be burns. But the medical observation of the corpses revealed something impossible. There was no physical trauma, no wounds, no bruises, no signs of a struggle. To put it simply, these people looked like they had been scared to death, but their bodies were physically untouched. This is where the ordinary explanations start to fall apart. If there was no weapon and no wound, you have to look for something that kills without touching. Some people point to chemical leaks or nerve agents, the kind of things that can shut down a nervous system in seconds. But the crew's expressions, that look of pure, wide-eyed terror, suggest they weren't just drifting off into unconsciousness. They were conscious and terrified of something they couldn't fight. As the men from the Silver Star stood there in the silence, they noticed one more thing that didn't fit. It was a clear summer day in the Indian Ocean, with temperatures soaring over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But as they moved through the corridors of the Ourang Medan, they felt a sudden chill. They took measurements and found that in some parts of the ship, the temperature had plummeted to 40 degrees. The crew was dead, the ship was freezing in the middle of a tropical ocean, and the bodies were already beginning to decompose at a speed that defied nature. The rescue party decided to tow the ship back to port, but the moment they tethered the two vessels together, the mystery turned into a countdown. Smoke began billowing from the number 4 cargo hold, and the air grew heavy with a threat that was no longer invisible. The rescue party had to act fast. They cut the tow ropes just as the ship reached a breaking point. Seconds later, the Ourang Medan exploded with such violence that her hull was torn apart, sending the evidence and the bodies spiraling into the deep. This sequence of events leaves a gap in the story. If the ship was carrying something so volatile it could blow a vessel apart, why was the crew found frozen in terror long before the fire started? Usually, a chemical or gas leak causes dizziness or sleep, not a collective state of panic. The image of the ship's dog, found with its lips peeled back in a vicious snarl, suggests the crew was reacting to a perceived predator. It mirrors other maritime mysteries where crews vanish or die without a trace. But the Ourang Medan left behind a crime scene with no crime. What could be cold enough to freeze a ship in the tropics, yet volatile enough to end in a fireball? The rescue party from the Silver Star found a place where the laws of nature seemed to have shifted. As they moved across the decks of the Ourang Medan, the men noticed something that didn't make sense. It was June in the Indian Ocean, a brutal summer day where the air was thick and the temperature was pushing 37 degrees Celsius, or about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But as soon as they stepped onto the ship, the heat vanished. The crew of the Silver Star reported a sudden piercing chill. When they took measurements, they found that temperatures on board had plummeted to as low as 4 degrees Celsius. That is 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of temperature you'd expect in a refrigerator, not on a steel deck baking under a tropical sun. This wasn't a breeze or a passing cloud. It was a localized cold snap that existed only within the confines of the ship. For people trying to make sense of this, the temperature drop is a red flag. In maritime mysteries, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature often points to something unnatural, but from a scientific perspective, it suggests a chemical reaction. Certain gases or volatile liquids can absorb heat from the surrounding environment when they leak or evaporate rapidly, creating a freezing effect. If the crew had been exposed to an industrial accident, the cold might have been the first sign of a leak. But if the air was that cold, why weren't the bodies preserved? That leads to the second anomaly the rescue party noticed. Despite the freezing temperatures on deck, the corpses were rotting. The observers noted that the remains were decomposing much faster than they should have been. Normally, extreme cold slows down decay. Here, the bodies were breaking down at an accelerated rate, as if something was eating them from the inside out or speeding up the biological clock of death. The contradiction between the freezing air and the rapid rot suggests the crew wasn't killed by a simple environmental shift. It points toward a biological or chemical agent. If a toxic gas or a caustic chemical had filled the ship, it could have caused the initial temperature drop through evaporation and then acted as a catalyst for decomposition, breaking down the cellular structure of the crew almost immediately after they died. This transforms the scene from a haunting mystery into a hazardous waste site. The question then becomes, what could be so dangerous that it freezes the air and melts the dead? The captain of the Silver Star didn't have the equipment to run a lab analysis in the middle of the ocean, but he had a job to do. He decided to tow the Ourang Medan back to port for salvage, wanting the ship secured and the bodies recovered. The two vessels were tethered together, bow to stern, and the Silver Star began to pull the ghost ship through the water. As they moved, the ship began to react. Smoke started billowing from below decks, specifically from the number 4 cargo hold. This wasn't a slow smolder, it was a sudden, aggressive fire. The crew of the Silver Star realized they were towing a ticking bomb. If the ship had been carrying volatile materials, perhaps the chemicals that caused the cold snap and the rapid decay, those materials had finally reached a tipping point. Whether it was a delayed chemical reaction or a fire sparked by the movement of the tow, the cargo hold was now an oven. The situation turned critical in seconds. The crew of the Silver Star acted fast, hacking through the tow ropes to disconnect themselves from the Ourang Medan before the fire could spread or pull them under. They barely cleared the area before a massive explosion ripped through the hull of the ship. The blast was so powerful it tore the vessel apart. The Ourang Medan sank rapidly into the depths of the Indian Ocean, pulling every piece of physical evidence down with it. The bodies, the logs, the radio equipment, and whatever was hidden in that 4th cargo hold vanished into the deep. This explosion is the most convenient part of the story. In any investigation, the physical evidence is what matters. You look at the blood spatter, you test the air, you examine the cargo. By sinking, the Ourang Medan erased the crime scene, leaving behind nothing but the testimony of the Silver Star's crew and a few fragmented reports. If the ship had been carrying something illegal, something a government or a private company didn't want the world to see, the explosion acted as a cleanup crew. It ensures we can never prove what was in that hold. It leaves the question of whether the fire was an accident caused by chemicals, or if the ship was designed to destroy itself once its mission failed. There are gaps here. We have a ship that doesn't appear on official registries, a crew that died in terror, and a vessel that vanished just as it was about to be inspected. When you put the physical anomalies together, the cold, the rot, and the fire, it looks less like a ghost story and more like a cover-up. To understand who would want to cover this up, we have to look at who was operating in those waters in 1947. The temperature shift is a jarring detail. On a summer day hitting 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the air on that deck was 40 degrees. That isn't a breeze or a strange current, it's a localized atmospheric collapse. In science, a sudden drop in temperature like that often happens when a gas expands rapidly or a chemical reaction absorbs all the heat from the surrounding air. If the crew was exposed to a leaking refrigerant or a pressurized chemical agent, it would explain why the air felt like winter in the middle of the tropics. But that cold doesn't explain the rot. Usually, extreme cold preserves a body by slowing down the bacteria that cause decay. Instead, the Silver Star crew reported that the corpses were decomposing faster than they should have. This is a contradiction. You have a freezing environment that should act like a refrigerator, yet the bodies are breaking down at an accelerated rate. This suggests that whatever killed the crew wasn't a gas that chilled the air, but a biological or chemical catalyst that attacked the organic tissue itself. It was as if the bodies were being digested from the inside out while the air around them froze. This brings us back to cargo hold number 4. The Silver Star had already tethered the ships and was preparing to tow the vessel to port when the smoke appeared. The fire didn't start in the engine room or the galley, it started deep in the belly of the ship. If the Ourang Medan was transporting volatile materials, perhaps nerve agents or unstable chemicals from the remnants of the war, the heat from the fire could have been the final stage of a chemical chain reaction. The timing of the explosion is where the tragedy becomes a conspiracy. The tow ropes were cut just moments before the hull ripped apart. The ship was obliterated. By the time the smoke cleared, the Ourang Medan was gone, and with it, the only way to verify if the crew had been poisoned, irradiated, or targeted by something else entirely. The events feel choreographed, a crew killed by an invisible force, a ship that defies the laws of temperature, and a sudden violent erasure of the evidence. It makes you wonder if the explosion was an accident, or if the ship was a floating time bomb, designed to vanish the moment it was discovered. If the Silver Star really found a ship full of corpses, there should be a paper trail. Every merchant vessel has a birth certificate, a registration number, a home port, and a record of who owned it and where it was built. Researchers went looking for the SS Ourang Medan in the official maritime archives. They checked the registries, they looked for accident reports, insurance claims, or death certificates for the crew. They found nothing. There is no record of a ship by that name ever being registered. No government agency has a file on its construction, and no maritime authority ever launched an official investigation into why a whole crew died in the middle of the ocean. Some say this is the smoking gun for a cover-up. They argue the ship was operating illegally, perhaps hauling something it shouldn't have, which is why it was scrubbed from the books. In that version of the story, the lack of records isn't proof the ship didn't exist, it's proof that someone with a lot of power wanted it to stay invisible. But if the ship was a ghost in the archives, it started acting like a ghost in the geography too. For years, the standard version of the story puts the Ourang Medan in the Straits of Malacca near Indonesia. That's where the Silver Star in the city of Baltimore supposedly picked up those Morse code messages in 1947. But when people started digging into older newspapers, they found something that didn't fit. Reports of the Ourang Medan appeared in Italy and England as early as 1940, 7 years before the Silver Star ever set sail for the Straits of Malacca. In those 1940 accounts, the ship isn't anywhere near Indonesia. The distress signals in those early stories were coming from the Pacific, specifically south of the Solomon Islands. The story is migrating. It moved thousands of miles across the ocean, shifting from the South Pacific to the East Indies, while the core of the horror stayed the same. The frozen faces, the sudden fire, and the ship sinking just as the rescuers arrived. This is where the theory of a hoax starts to carry more weight than the theory of a cover-up. If a story is true, the location usually stays put. If a story is a legend, it tends to drift and adapt to whatever waters the storyteller is sailing in. It becomes a piece of folklore, a maritime campfire story that gets polished and embellished every time it's told. By the time it reached the 1948 reports, the details were richer, the corpses were more grotesque, and the timeline had shifted to fit a newer setting. But that creates a different problem. If the Ourang Medan was just a piece of fiction, why did it appear in newspapers across different countries at the same time? Why would a fake story about a ghost ship be reported as news in 1940, only to reappear with new details years later? If the ship never existed, we aren't looking for a lost vessel anymore. We're looking for the person who invented it, and the reason they wanted the world to believe in a ship where everyone died of fright. That search for a creator leads to the archives. When researchers tried to pin the ship down with hard data, they hit a wall. There is no official registration for a vessel called the Ourang Medan, no insurance claims, no crew manifests, and no accident investigation reports in any maritime registry. In the shipping world, every hull has a paper trail. Even a ship operating illegally or carrying contraband usually leaves a ghost of a record, a port entry, a sighting by a coast guard, or a mention in a company ledger. But the Ourang Medan is a void. This suggests two possibilities. Either the ship was a complete phantom, a piece of creative writing that tricked newspapers into reporting it as fact, or it was operating so far outside the law that it existed off the books entirely. If it was the latter, the lack of records is a sign of a secret. It means the ship was a ghost long before the crew died. Looking at the records from 1947, the story feels like a finished movie. You have the silver star, the frozen faces of the dead, and that final Morse code message, "I die." But when researchers dug into older archives, they found an earlier draft. Reports of the Ourang Medan appeared in newspapers back in 1940, 7 years before the Silver Star ever set sail. But the 1940 version isn't the same story. In this version, the ship isn't in the Straits of Malacca, it's drifting south of the Solomon Islands. The SOS messages are different too. The 1940 transmission doesn't end with a poetic death wish. Instead, it's a frantic plea for a doctor, mentioning that the second officer is already dead and the rest of the crew is dying. It's a medical emergency, not a supernatural horror scene. The narrative starts to fray here. If the Ourang Medan was a real ship that suffered a specific tragedy, the details should stay the same. Instead, the story grew. By 1947 and 1948, the plea for a doctor was replaced by the image of corpses with gaping mouths and staring eyes. The location shifted thousands of miles. The tragedy was being rewritten and embellished as it moved through the decades. When a story changes like that, it usually evolves into a legend. It's what happens when a rumor passes through a dozen different people, and each person adds a detail to make it more frightening. This suggests the Ourang Medan wasn't a ship that disappeared, but a story that was being built. To find out who was building it, investigators traced the reports back to their roots. They found that the 1948 accounts, which cemented the ghost ship in the public imagination, didn't come from a shipping log or a government report. They were attributed to a single man, Silvio Shirley, based in Trieste, Italy. Shirley wasn't a captain or a survivor. He was the source for the journalistic reports that spread the tale across Europe and eventually to the United States. When the entire mystery hinges on the word of one man in Italy, the ghost ship looks less like a maritime mystery and more like a piece of journalistic fiction. Shirley just made it up. It explains why there's no official registration for the ship, no record of its construction, and no accident report in any naval archive. He created a vacuum, a ship that officially never existed, which made it the perfect vessel for every conspiracy theory imaginable. But that creates a new problem. If the story was a fabrication by a man in Italy, why did it start appearing in UK newspapers as early as 1940? Why would a hoaxer spend nearly a decade slowly leaking different versions of the same lie? It suggests Shirley might not have been the inventor, but just another link in a chain. The Ourang Medan might have started as a real, smaller tragedy, perhaps a ship that actually lost its crew to a chemical leak or a plague, and then was hijacked by people who wanted to turn a tragedy into a myth. The story was intentionally distorted to hide a real event. We have to ask what was actually happening in those waters in 1940. If the ghost ship was a cover, what was the real secret it was designed to protect? The answer might be hidden in the way the messages changed. In the 1940 reports, the SOS is a desperate plea for a doctor, specifically mentioning that the second officer is dead. It feels like a real-time emergency. But by 1947, the message transforms. It becomes a cinematic script where the operator calmly reports that everyone is dead in the chart room before typing the final words, "I die." The story stopped being a report of a medical crisis and became a gothic horror. This shift suggests the narrative was being polished for an audience, rewritten to be more haunting each time it crossed a border. When you compare the 1940 version in the Solomon Islands to the 1948 version in the Straits of Malacca, the geography shifts thousands of miles, but the core image remains, a ship full of frozen, staring corpses. If this was a cover for a real event, we're looking at a pattern of deliberate erasure. Someone took a specific tragedy and smeared it across the map, changing the dates and the dialogue until the original truth was buried under layers of urban legend. To solve a mystery, you usually look for more evidence. But with the Ourang Medan, the answer came from looking at the calendar. For decades, the story was anchored to a specific moment, 1947. That was the year the distress calls allegedly hit the radio waves in the Strait of Malacca. It was the date that gave the story a sense of history, making it feel like a forgotten Cold War secret. Then, a researcher digging through old archives found something that didn't fit. They discovered reports of the Ourang Medan in UK newspapers from 1940. The story was appearing in the English press, 7 years before the event was even supposed to have happened. It was 12 years before the earliest known mentions of the case in the United States. These 1940 reports described the same fate, a ship of dead men with frozen expressions, but the details shifted. In these earlier versions, the ship wasn't in the Strait of Malacca. It was near the Solomon Islands. The SOS message was different too. This is what historians call an anachronism. An anachronism is just a fancy word for something that is placed in the wrong time period. If you see a photo of a knight in armor wearing a digital watch, you know the photo is a fake because the watch didn't exist yet. In this case, the story existed before the date of the tragedy. The timeline suggests the 1947 date wasn't a record of a real event, but a detail added to a story that was already circulating. If the story was traveling through newspapers years before the incident, the most likely explanation is that the Ourang Medan never sailed. It wasn't a secret mission or a chemical leak. It was a hoax, a piece of fiction that got repeated so often it started to look like a historical record. When you strip away the dates and the fake logs, the Ourang Medan starts to look less like a maritime mystery and more like a tradition. It fits perfectly into the long history of phantom ships. Sailors have always told stories about vessels like the Flying Dutchman, a ship condemned to sail the seas forever, or the Mary Celeste, a real derelict found drifting with its crew missing. These legends usually follow a specific pattern. A ship is found, the crew is gone or dead in a way that defies logic, and then the ship vanishes or sinks just as investigators arrive. The Ourang Medan checks every single box. The staring eyes, the gaping mouths, the sudden explosion that erased the evidence, these are the hallmarks of maritime folklore. They are the ghost stories of the ocean, designed to capture the imagination of people on land and keep sailors cautious of the deep. The story likely began as a tall tale, perhaps sparked by a real, smaller tragedy or a piece of sensationalist journalism in the 1940s. Once it hit the papers, it became a game of telephone. Each retelling added a new detail to make it scarier or more mysterious, until the fiction became a case that people tried to solve. So we are left with a choice. We can believe in a ship that officially never existed, carrying a cargo that was never listed, manned by a crew that left no names behind. Or we can accept that the Ourang Medan is just a modern myth, a ghost ship born from ink and paper rather than salt and iron. But if the whole thing was a hoax, why does the image of those frozen, terrified faces still feel so real? The answer might lie in how we treat the truth when it's wrapped in a good story. If the Ourang Medan was a fabrication, it was a masterclass in psychological horror. By using the trope of the phantom ship, the creator tapped into a primal fear of the unknown that has persisted since the days of the Flying Dutchman. It transforms a simple lie into a shared cultural experience. When we look at the 1940 UK reports, the pattern becomes clear. The story evolved. It moved from the Solomon Islands to the Strait of Malacca, and the SOS messages shifted to fit the mood of the era. This isn't how a historical record works, but it is how a legend grows. The Ourang Medan actually sailed. We have to explain why the timeline breaks. We have to wonder why a ship would be reported in English newspapers 7 years before it supposedly sent its final distress call. The evidence suggests the ship never left the printing press. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.